Tell me, Mr. Trump, does your mother have something to hide? Or is it just another layer of the family smoke and mirrors? The voice of the journalist slices through the press room, laced with venom. Cameras click wildly, pens remain poised in midair. All eyes rest on the youngest Trump at the heart of this storm, calm, giving nothing away. This was not the question anybody expected. This was war. Thick with expectation, with an anticipation of a revelation, the air was heavy inside the room. Rows of journalists, donning sharp suits on their bodies and even sharper tongues inside their mouths, leaned forward in their chairs. Whispers buzzed through the air, but a question from this audacious reporter silenced even the most hardened skeptic. This journalist, in his mid-40s, had a smug grin on his face, led popular ruthless takedowns, and had just crossed a line no one thought possible. The spotlight was on Barron Trump. He sat there, composed, hands resting easily on the table. The boy who was once cosseted away from public life had become its epicenter. The navy suit, crisp white shirt, and carefully combed hair were all impeccable, but it was the air that did the trick. He didn't bat an eyelid. He didn't blink. He merely cocked his head slightly to one side, as if weighing up his opponent. Do you think your mother has something to hide? Barron asked, his voice even, carrying a surprising weight of authority. The journalist leaned back in his chair, his smirk spreading. That's the rumor, isn't it? Unverified trips abroad, questionable dealings in Slovenia. Surely, someone has to ask the hard questions. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the most seasoned reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Provocative questions were one thing, outright accusations were another. Barron's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, fingers interlaced. Rumors, he began, his voice cutting through the silence, are a powerful weapon when used careless. They can ruin reputations, incite fear, and most dangerously divert attention from the truth. But you already know that, don't you? The journalist's smirk faltered, just for a second, but Barron caught it. As did the cameras. The tension was palpable now. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air heavier with every passing second. Whispers turned to murmurs, and the murmurs turned to stunned silence as Barron reached into his pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper and placed it on the table in front of him. This, he said, tapping the paper with his finger, is a statement from the Slovenian consulate, confirming every trip my mother has taken in the past 2 decades. I'll leave it here for anyone who cares to fact-check. Gasps echoed again, but Barron wasn't finished. He met the journalist's gaze directly, unflinching. And about the shady dealings, he continued, I think you'll find that the documents you referred to are part of an investigation that is ongoing and one in which she has already come out clean. But perhaps your sources didn't give you the updates? The journalist's face reddened. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Barron was cool, calculated, and tore him apart brick by brick, and the room relished it. The cameras captured every nuance, every flicker of faltering confidence from the journalist. In the back of the room, the veteran reporter from a competing network leaned over to her colleague. He's not just defending her, she whispered. He's turning the tables. Look at his composure. That's not a child responding. That's a tactician. And she was right. Barron wasn't playing defense. He was tearing down the opposition, one carefully chosen word at a time. The burden of proof, Barron said, his voice calm but unyielding, lies with the accuser. Isn't that journalism 101? Or have standards changed while I've been studying for finals? A ripple of laughter erupted in the room, cutting through the tension. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to shift the power dynamic. For the first time, the journalist looked genuinely rattled. Barron leaned back in his chair, his face neutral, but his eyes 2 sharp blades. So, if you have real evidence, please share. Otherwise, I suggest we move on to questions that actually matter. The room exploded. The journalist's face was a mix of fury and humiliation as he fumbled with his notes. Barron remained unruffled, however. His gaze never wavered. He knew that this round had been won. The cameras captured it all, The smirk that danced back onto Barron's lips, the beads of sweat welling on the journalist's brow, and the murmurs of approval that spread through the room. For the first time, it wasn't just the journalist in the hot seat. It was Barron Trump, the teenager who had just silenced an entire room full of critics with nothing other than truth and poise. And this was only the beginning. "That's an impressive performance, young man," the journalist sneered, leaning forward as if to pounce. "But tell me this, if everything is so clean, why is your mother's name whispered in backrooms all across Washington? What's being hidden, Barron? Or should I say, who?" The room gasped. The gloves were off. The press room seemed to hold its collective breath. What had been palpable was now suffocating. The journalist's calculated attack struck like a thunderclap, reverberating across the rows of faces that stared in stunned disbelief. He had crossed another line, and everybody knew it. Yet he didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned in closer, his words emboldened by his very audacity. Barron didn't bat an eye. Not a twitch of a muscle on his face betrayed the storm brewing in the room as his eyes, steady and firm, fixed upon the journalist in a predator-like stare meant to freeze its prey. There was a moment of silence, and it made all the weight of the accusation fall upon them. Then Barron spoke. "It is funny," he said, still even, "how people like you would hang on to whispers when the truth is too inconvenient to accept." The room inhaled as one. Barron's words were more than an answer. It was a challenge, and the waves lashed over the sea of faces in the audience. Cameras focused on him, every angle of his face being seen. It was a game of wits, with Barron leading the first round. The journalist's smirk faltered for a moment. He leaned back in his chair, fighting to regain his composure. "Oh, come on," he said, flicking a hand. "Let's not pretend your family's spotless record isn't a well-curated facade. I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire, isn't that right?" Barron's eyes cut slightly, though his voice betrayed no inflection. "Let me ask you a question," he said. "If you are so certain about your smoke and fire analogy, why have you yet to produce one ember? With the resources at your disposal, the unceasing curiosity, surely you have more than hot air." A murmur swept the room. The journalist's face grew a shade redder. Barron wasn't just holding his ground, he was pushing back, and in so doing, revealing how flimsy the accusations actually were. For a few minutes, the dynamics shifted in the room, and one could feel it. "We're not here to debate semantics, Barron," the journalist snapped, his tone sharpening. "We're here to uncover the truth. And the truth is, your mother's connections to certain, let's call them unsavory individuals, have been a topic of concern for years." Another gasp. This time, it was louder, more visceral. The audience was on the edge of their seats, their eyes darting between Barron and the journalists like spectators at a high-stakes tennis match. Barron's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Concern," he echoed, drawing out the word. "It's interesting how concern often disguises itself as speculation. But let's not dance around the issue. You're implying guilt by association, aren't you?" The journalist hesitated, caught off guard by Barron's directness. "I'm implying nothing," he said, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. "I'm simply asking questions that the public deserves answers to." Barron's smile widened, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was a smile that spoke of someone who saw through the game and was ready to dismantle it. "Very well," Barron said, leaning forward slightly, his tone still measured but now with an edge of steel. "Let's talk about these so-called connections. Are you referring to the charity work my mother has done in impoverished regions? Or perhaps her advocacy for women's rights on international stages? Because if that's the case, then I'm curious to know what you've done lately to make the world a better place." Murmurs filled the room. The journalist's face turned beet red as he struggled to find the words. But Barron wasn't through. "Or," he went on, his voice hardening, "are you suggesting that simply meeting people from diverse backgrounds, some of whom may not fit your definition of acceptable, is enough to tarnish someone's reputation? If that's the standard we're holding everyone to, then perhaps you should start by disclosing the names of every individual you've ever associated with." The journalist's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The audience's murmurs grew louder, a wave of approval washing over the room. Barron had turned the tables so completely that the journalist's bravado now looked like desperation. The atmosphere was electric. Barron sat back in his chair, his face calm but victorious. The journalist fumbled through his notes, taken aback. For the first time in his career, he seemed to realize his usual tactics weren't going to work. Not this time. Barron's last words sliced through the noise like a blade. Truth, he said, isn't something you find in whispers or insinuations. It's something you earn by asking the right questions and having the courage to face the answers. If you're ready for that, I'm more than happy to continue this conversation. But if not, I believe the nation has heard enough. The room exploded in applause, cameras flashing to record the moment for history. The journalist sat frozen, his confidence torn to shreds. But Barron did not bat an eyelid. His gaze never left the target, his poise unbroken. And with that, the second round was over. But the battle was far from finished. You think your words can silence me, Barron? The journalist snapped, his voice shaking in fury and desperation. Let me tell you something, a paper trail doesn't erase whispers, and it doesn't erase power. So, what is it you're hiding? Why are you so calm? What do you know that we don't? The room froze. Barron leaned forward, his face sharpening. You want to know what I know? Fine. Let's talk about you. The air crackled with anticipation as Barron cut the tension with his words, as with a scalpel. The cameras almost seemed to freeze in that moment, framing in the raw intensity of that instant. The journalist, visibly quite upset now, readjusted his tie, his bravado falling with each silent second. His eyes never left the lenses. His voice, low, cut through the din of the hall but was commanding, nonetheless. You came here looking for a scandal, hoping to paint my family as something we're not. But tell me, who's holding you accountable? What skeletons are hiding in your closet? Gasps rippled across the room. The tables had turned. Predator was now prey. The journalist regained his composure. This isn't about me, he stammered, his tone wavering. This is about the public's right to know. A slight smile curled Barron's lips. The public deserves the truth, he said, and that includes the truth about the people who claim to speak for them. You see, I've done my homework too. And I have to wonder, why is it that someone with such a long career in journalism seems so intent on twisting facts? Perhaps it has something to do with those funding your work? The room fell silent. The journalist's face turned white, his hand clenching on the edge of the desk. What do you insinuate? He demanded in a cracking voice. Barron didn't bat an eyelash. I insinuate nothing, he returned suavely. I am but stating a pattern. A pattern of targeting certain people, of conveniently overlooking the key details, and of enjoying considerable financial support from, well, let's say, less than impartial sources. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. His colleagues looked at each other uneasily. They had come for a takedown, but this they had not bargained for. Barron was not merely defending himself, he was destroying the foundation upon which the attack was based. Deflecting, the journalist spat, though much of the bite had left his tone. It's nothing but a distraction. Barron's face went cold. A distraction? He echoed, amazement heavy in his voice. You are the one who arrived armed with unfounded accusations with the intention of smearing my family, and now it's a distraction because the light has turned to you? The journalist opened his mouth to respond, but Barron cut him off. Let me make one thing clear, Barron said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. This isn't about deflection. This is about accountability. If you want to play the role of judge, jury, and executioner, then you'd better be prepared to face the same scrutiny you demand of others. The audience erupted into murmurs. Barron's words had struck a nerve, not just with the journalist, but with everyone in the room. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that even the most skeptical observers couldn't deny what was happening. Barron Trump was no longer the underdog. He was in control. The journalist, now visibly sweating, fumbled with his notes. This isn't over, he muttered weakly. Barron leaned back in his chair, his calm composure unbroken. "You're right," he said. "It's not over. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard people try to bury it." The cameras caught every second of the exchange, sending the drama to millions of viewers. Thus, social media was at work, ablaze with trending worldwide hashtags such as #BarronUnleashed and #TruthMatters. The journalist, who had once terrorized his counterparts in the field, was now a vision of near breakdown. Murmurs filled the room, and the impression was given that the challenge of Barron's last words seemed to hang in the air. "If you have nothing to hide," he said, "then you have nothing to fear." "Isn't that what you always tell us?" The journalist said nothing. He could say nothing. The room erupted into applause as Barron rose, his eyes raking the room. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And everybody knew that. "Enough games, Barron!" the journalist yelled, slamming his hand onto the desk. His voice boomed in the hushed room. "If you want to play the hero, let's see how you handle real evidence. We've uncovered something your family never wanted the public to see." A flash drive materialized in his hand, its ominous presence like a loaded weapon. The room held its breath as Barron leaned forward, his calm exterior finally showing a crack. "Go ahead," he said, his voice chillingly even. "Show them." The tension was no longer bearable. Literally, every camera lens in that room zoomed on that small device, with the promise of its contents hanging over the room like a guillotine. Smugness once more crossed the face of the journalist as he plugged the drive into his laptop, projecting its contents onto the big screen behind his back. The room was thick with the collective gasp of the audience. Grainy photos and emails emerged. Their vague captions were supposed to imply scandal, yet nothing concrete proved anything. The journalist's voice rose, dripping with self-righteous triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the so-called untainted legacy of the Trump family, transactions, connections, and backroom deals that should make every American question the people claiming to represent them." His face expressionless, eyes on the screen, Barron slowly rose from his seat. Murmurs in the room started getting louder as if the tide were to turn against him. Then, he stood up. The room was suddenly silent while he moved towards the screen, every step deliberate, and presence commanding. "This is what you've got?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with incredulity. "Photos taken out of context? Emails without timestamps or credible sources? You call this evidence? I call it desperation." The journalist's smugness wavered. "Desperation?" he shot back, though his voice lacked its earlier force. "These images speak for themselves." Barron turned to the audience, his eyes locking onto them. "Do they?" he asked, his voice rising. "Or do they speak to a deeper issue? The willingness of some to manipulate the truth for personal gain?" The only sound in the room, except for the clicking of cameras to capture every second, was silence. The next move by Barron was a calculated gamble. He turned back to the journalist. "You want to talk about evidence?" he said, his voice razor-sharp. "Let's talk about your evidence. Where did it come from? Who provided it? And more to the point, what was their agenda?" The journalist faltered, his confidence cracked. "The public has a right to know." "The public has a right to the truth," Barron cut in, his voice slicing through the journalist's weak protest. "And the fact of the matter is, this so-called evidence is nothing more than a poorly constructed narrative designed to distract and discredit." Barron turned to the screen, gesturing at the images. "These photos?" he said, pointing to a particularly grainy one. "This was taken at a public charity event, an event that your network covered. The email?" He tapped on another. "This was part of a chain disproven years ago, something you'd know if you bothered to do your homework." The face of the journalist went red. Murmurs around the room took on a louder pitch as the words of Barron struck home. He had turned the attack into an indictment of the journalist's credibility, and the audience listened. The final move by Barron was a masterstroke. He turned back to the crowd, his voice ringing with conviction. "This isn't just about my family," he said. "It's about all of us. It's about the lengths some will go to twist the narrative, to create division, and to distract from the real issues. Don't let them. The room erupted into applause. The journalist slumped in his chair, defeated. The audience's energy had wholly shifted now, the tide firmly in Barron's favor. As Barron sat back down, the journalist was to make one last, desperate attempt to wrestle back some semblance of control. "This isn't over," he muttered, though his voice was barely audible. Barron didn't even look at him. "No," he said, his voice calm but final. "It's just beginning." The cameras caught the moment, relaying it to millions. Hashtags #Barron triumphs and #expose the truth trended within minutes. But as the room began to clear, one thing was clear to all who had been there. This wasn't just a victory that belonged to Barron. It was a reckoning.